A young U.S. Marine returned home to Maine with nothing but his scars, his uniform, and a promise to protect his little sister. Desperate to keep a roof over her head, he bought an abandoned hotel at auction for less than he had in his pocket. But behind a sealed steel door, he uncovered a secret worth hundreds of millions and a choice that would test his soul. Stay with us for this unforgettable story, and if you believe integrity matters more than fortune, make sure to like and subscribe. Ethan Cole stepped off the Greyhound bus with the stiffness of someone who had marched too many miles under too many suns. At 28, he had the kind of face that still carried youth in its lines, but also shadows older than his years. The air in rural Maine was sharp, with late autumn full of damp pine and wood smoke, and as he drew it in, his left shoulder flared with pain, a reminder of shrapnel that doctors said would always be with him. Ethan welcomed the ache. It was honest, unlike the other wounds that lived only in the dark corners of his sleep. Millbrook was quiet. Houses leaned against the wind porches, sagged with the weight of years. Ethan walked the cracked sidewalk toward the place he used to call home, boots thudding softly, duffel heavy against his hip. On the porch sat Lily, just 11, her sweater sleeves pulled over her hands. Her face lit up when she saw him, though her smile trembled at the edges. "You wore it," she whispered, eyes catching on his Marine uniform. He managed a tired grin. "For you." She threw her arms around him, and for a moment he let himself believe he could still be her anchor. Inside the house smelled of damp walls and reheated spaghetti. On the table waited a pile of unopened mail. Ethan sifted through envelopes until one stopped him, cold final notice stamped in red. Atlantic Savings Bank demanded what he didn't have. If he couldn't pay within weeks, the only home Lily knew would be gone. He set it down carefully, as though gentleness could erase the ink. That night, while Lily hummed in the bath, he opened his battered laptop. Bills and numbers lined up like enemies in formation. His disability check, hazard pay, and savings added to just over $7,200. It wasn't enough. He rubbed his scarred shoulder, trying to breathe steady, trying not to think about sand gunfire, the smell of burning metal. Scrolling through county notices, his eyes snagged on a headline, "Public Auction Pine Harbor Hotel. Minimum bid $7,500. He knew the building, a 5-story hulk on Elm Street, abandoned for 25 years, whispered about by kids as haunted. He stared at the screen, heart beating hard. 7,500. He had 7,200 and change. Too short, but so close it felt like fate leaning over his shoulder. When Lily padded in with wet hair and asked, "Are we okay?" He pulled her into his arms. "We will be," he said, voice rough. Later, alone in the kitchen with only the hum of the fridge, he whispered the number again, $7,500, like a prayer he wasn't sure anyone was listening to. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish, the kind of scent that clung to places where time moved slowly. And few people came except for matters of trouble. Ethan sat on the hard bench, his uniform pressed as sharply as he could manage, the weight of his duffel resting at his feet, like a silent companion. Beside him, Lily fidgeted with the frayed cuff of her sweater, her eyes darting around the nearly empty room. There were only a handful of people scattered across the benches. An elderly man with a cane who seemed half asleep, a couple of contractors whispering to each other, and a local shop owner tapping her foot impatiently. The auctioneer, a thin man with a thinning voice, cleared his throat as if trying to summon authority. Next item, he announced the Pine Harbor Hotel on Elm Street. Minimum bid $7,500. His words hung in the air, met by silence. Ethan's chest tightened. He knew what the building looked like, 5 stories of brick, with windows like blind eyes, but he also knew what it could mean, a roof that belonged to them, a place where Lily could hang drawings on the walls without fear of eviction, a chance for something permanent in a life that had been anything but. The silence stretched longer, the auctioneer repeating the number with less conviction each time. Still, no one moved. The contractors shook their heads, muttering about liability. The shop owner snorted softly, as if the very thought were absurd. Rumors about the place, stories of an accident, whispers of shadows moving in the upper floors, seemed to hang heavier than the dust in the rafters. Ethan felt the envelope in his pocket heavy with a cashier's check made out for $7,200, the full measure of every cent he had left. His pulse quickened as he did the math in his head again and again, $300 short, a gap as wide as a canyon in a moment like this. He looked at Lily, who gave him a small nod, her eyes wide but steady. He rose his boots, scuffing against the wooden floor, and the room turned toward him, as though a gust of wind had shifted the air. 7,200. He said, his voice even, but carrying the weight of a man who had no other choice. A beat of silence, then a ripple of laughter. One of the contractors leaned back and smirked, a Marine without a job trying to buy a death trap. He murmured just loud enough for others to hear, and the chuckles spread. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he did not flinch. He had faced worse than this in deserts far away, and he would not let a room of small-town skeptics break him. The auctioneer frowned. "Sir, the minimum is $7,500, he reminded almost apologetically. Ethan reached into his pocket and placed the check on the table in front of him, the paper trembling slightly only because his hands were tired, not because his will was. "This is everything I have," he said simply. "Every cent. 7,200. He did not add that it was money earned in nights of pain, in days of labor, that had cost him pieces of himself. The room was quiet again, the laughter dying down into a kind of uneasy murmur. The auctioneer glanced at the town clerk, a stout woman with spectacles perched low on her nose. She shrugged, her expression weary. "It's been empty for 25 years, she said flatly. "On the record, the council waives the minimum pursuant to our nuisance property resolution. It costs the town more in upkeep and liability than it's worth. Let him have it." The auctioneer hesitated a moment longer, then raised his gavel. Going once, going twice. His voice wavered as though he was still waiting for anyone to intervene. But the room remained still. Sold to Mr. Cole for $7,200. The gavel came down with a hollow crack that echoed off the paneled walls. Ethan exhaled a breath he did not know he had been holding, his knees almost buckling under the sudden release of tension. Lily clutched his arm, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He signed the papers with a steady hand, though inside he felt the enormity of what he had just done pressing against his ribs. The hotel was theirs now, or at least his responsibility was. The clerk slid the documents toward him, her gaze softening for just a moment, as though she saw past the uniform into the fatigue etched beneath it. Outside, the sky had turned gray, the kind of sky that pressed down like a weight, but Ethan felt a spark of something unfamiliar flicker in his chest. It was not victory, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile outline of a beginning. Lily tugged at his sleeve as they stepped into the cold air. "Does this mean we have a home?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at her at the way her small hand fit into his, and he swallowed the truth that threatened to rise. "It means," he said carefully, "that we have a chance." The words hung between them, fragile as glass, but Lily smiled as though they were solid enough to hold her weight. They walked down the courthouse steps together, past the stares of those who had mocked him, and toward a building waiting like a wounded giant at the end of Elm Street, its secrets locked behind chained doors. The Pine Harbor Hotel stood at the end of Elm Street like a relic from another age, its windows dark and streaked with grime, its once grand awning torn and sagging like tired shoulders. Ethan and Lily stood before it on their first evening, as its unlikely owners, duffels in hand, their breath visible in the chill air. The chains clattered when Ethan unlocked the front door with the heavy key he had been given at the courthouse, the sound echoing far too loudly in the silence of the street. When the door finally gave way, the air that greeted them was heavy and sour, thick with mold and the unmistakable scent of decay. Inside, the lobby stretched wide and empty marble floors, hidden beneath layers of dust paint curling down the walls in strips and cobwebs gathered like curtains along the ceiling corners. Somewhere deep within, water dripped in hollow rhythms, a sound that carried into the empty space like a clock no one had wound down. Lily pressed closer to his side, her nose wrinkling. "It smells like something died in here," she whispered, and Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, steady, firm. "It's just old," he said, though even he felt his stomach turn at the odor of rodents long gone. They made their way to the second floor, finding a room with a door that still closed and a window that had not yet shattered. The ceiling sagged slightly in one corner, where water had eaten through the plaster, and the radiator was silent, its rusted pipes cold to the touch. Ethan spread his old blanket on the floor, adding Lily's sleeping bag beside it. She looked at him with wide eyes, her face pale in the dim light of his flashlight. "Do you really think this place can be a home?" she asked. He pulled her closer, brushing dust from her hair. "I promise," he said the word heavy, "but steady, I'll make it one." Later, after Lily drifted into a restless sleep, Ethan lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the groans of the old building as wind pressed against its bones. His mind betrayed him, pulling him back to the desert where the air had been filled with the rattle of gunfire and the sudden bloom of smoke. He dreamt of a patrol gone wrong, the scream of metal, the taste of sand in his teeth. When he jolted awake, sweat damp on his neck, the shadows of the hotel folded around him like a net. For a moment he had no sense of place until he heard another sound, soft, muffled, not from a dream at all. He sat up quickly, his heart pounding in the old rhythm of readiness. Lily was crying quietly, curled in her sleeping bag, her small hands over her ears. He moved to her side, at once kneeling. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She pointed upward toward the ceiling, her face wet with tears. "I heard someone walking," she whispered. Ethan listened. The wind rattled loose panes of glass, and the pipes clinked faintly somewhere behind the walls, but then a sound. A slow creak, deliberate from above. He stilled every sense alert. There was no one else here. There could not be. Yet the weight of that step pressed through the ceiling, as if the building itself confirmed Lily's fear. He soothed her, whispering that she was safe, that he would check, and when she clung to his hand, he gently eased her grip free. Taking the flashlight, he moved into the hall. The air grew colder as he climbed the stairwell to the 5th floor, his boots scuffing against the worn steps. The hotel groaned around him, its silence deeper now, watching. At the far end of the hallway, behind a utility closet, he found what he had not expected, a narrow staircase leading up further still. His breath caught. The hotel was supposed to be 5 stories tall, no more. Yet here was a stairwell leading beyond, dark and unused. At the top, a steel door loomed, its surface scarred by time, but unbroken, its hasps bound by a welded chain and a few corroded tack welds around the latch. A chain crossed its handles, fused shut. Someone long ago had not merely locked this floor, but buried it alive, ensuring no one would enter. Ethan shone his flashlight across the welded seams, the dust clinging like frost. He touched the cold metal with his hand, and the chill ran through him in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Behind that door lay something deliberately hidden, and perhaps deliberately dangerous. He stood there longer than he meant to, the silence pressing against him, the memory of Lily's frightened eyes echoing in his thoughts. At last he stepped back, forcing himself down the stairs, his grip tight around the flashlight, until his knuckles whitened. Back in the room, he found Lily waiting, her small face searching his for answers he could not yet give. He sat beside her, pulling the blanket over both of them, and said only, "The building makes strange noises. It's nothing we can't handle." She nodded, trusting him more than the shadows that crept along the walls, and eventually her eyes closed, though her hand stayed curled in the fabric of his sleeve. Ethan lay awake until the thin hours of morning, the image of the welded steel door fixed in his mind, a question that would not release him. Morning in Millbrook came pale and cold. The sun filtered through bare branches and catching on the broken glass panes of the Pine Harbor Hotel like a warning light. Ethan rose before Lily pulled on his work boots and walked to the lumber yard on the edge of town, where he had taken a day job stacking beams and sanding planks. The pay was meager, but each dollar meant one more nail, one more piece of plaster, one step closer to turning the ruin into something livable. He worked until his hands blistered, then returned to the hotel in the late afternoon, with boards strapped to his shoulder and the smell of pine clinging to his clothes. Inside, Lily waited at a small table she had cleaned with rags, her pencil moving across the pages of a composition notebook. She looked up, smiling shyly, then showed him a drawing. A tall house with shining windows, smoke curling from a chimney, and two figures standing side by side. "It's us," she said. Beneath the sketch she had written in her uneven hand, "A home with bright windows where Ethan does not dream of bad things anymore." He studied it for a long moment, swallowing hard, then ruffled her hair, and told her it was perfect. At night he patched leaks in the roof, hammered boards across broken windows, and rewired circuits by watching tutorials on his cracked phone screen. The work was backbreaking the building stubborn, but with each repaired corner he felt a flicker of purpose. The hotel was no longer just brick and rot. It was a battlefield he could fight on and perhaps win. Yet strange things unsettled the edges of their days. One afternoon, while fixing a corroded pipe in the kitchen, Ethan paused, wrench in hand. Above him, faint but undeniable, came the steady hum of machinery, like the low growl of an engine running somewhere far above the ceiling. His brow furrowed. Every outlet he tested in the main circuits was dead, every breaker box stripped bare. Yet somewhere above, machines hummed, as if they were fed by a hidden independent power supply. He climbed halfway up the stairwell before stopping, remembering the welded steel door, the heavy chain that sealed it shut. He listened, his breath held, until the noise faded into silence, leaving only the moan of the wind through broken vents. Returning to Lily, he found her at her notebook again. She asked if he was all right, and he forced a smile, telling her it had only been the plumbing rattling. But as he lay awake that night, the phantom hum threaded through his mind like a pulse he could not ignore. Days later, while cleaning out the basement, Ethan stumbled upon something unexpected. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed by his boots as he moved past collapsed shelves and rusted tools. In a far corner, half buried beneath old tarps, lay a small wooden chest, its lid swollen with moisture. He pried it open, coughing at the mold, and inside found little more than scraps of paper, brittle with age. But beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a corroded basement key, its bow faintly etched with the number 601. He held it up to the dim light filtering through a grate, turning it in his hand, the chill of the metal sinking into his skin. His thoughts leapt immediately to the welded door upstairs, to the possibility of a lock, once meant to be opened, not buried. Sliding the key into his pocket, he stood in the silence of the basement, the faint smell of mildew pressing in around him. He could hear Lily humming faintly somewhere above, scribbling dreams into her notebook, as though words alone could protect them. For the first time since returning home, Ethan felt a shiver, not of cold, but of recognition. The hotel was keeping secrets, and he had just stumbled onto its first whisper. The storm rolled in from the coast with a sound like artillery rain striking the old hotel in relentless sheets, rattling the broken shutters and seeping through the cracks in the roof that Ethan had not yet patched. He sat in the lobby with Lily curled against him, both listening to the downpour as if it were a voice whispering secrets into the bones of the building. The key marked 601 weighed in his pocket, pressing against his leg with every breath. For days he had turned it over in his hand, wondering if it belonged to the sealed door, wondering if the hum of machinery he had heard had come from behind that barrier. Now, with the storm masking every other sound, he felt a pull he could not ignore. He kissed the top of Lily's head and told her to stay in her sleeping bag, then took the crowbar and hammer he had kept from the basement. She watched him climb the stairs, her small voice following him into the shadows. "Be careful." The stairwell to the 5th floor smelled of rust and damp stone. At its end, the narrow service stairs rose again, and there, waiting at the top, was the door that had haunted his thoughts. Rain banged against the high windows of the corridor, flashes of lightning sketching the steel in stark white. The welded seams seemed to sneer at him, daring him to try. He set the crowbar into the seam of the chain and pressed until the metal screamed sparks of rust flaking off. His muscles burned, his shoulder scar protested, but he did not stop. He hammered until the iron bent, until the tack welds around the latch popped, until the old chain clattered loose to the ground, with a final shriek that echoed through the stairwell. The door shuddered. Ethan pressed his shoulder against it and drove forward with a grunt, the hinges groaning, resisting, then yielding. With a burst of stale air, the doorway opened, and he stumbled into a silence unlike any other in the building. He lifted his flashlight, expecting rot and dust, but froze. The hallway before him was immaculate. Wallpaper pale gold with intricate patterns lined the walls without a tear. Carpet stretched soft and clean under his boots, bearing no dust, no mold, no sign of time. Light glowed dimly overhead, not from his flashlight, but from fixtures tied to a separate service and battery bank casting a faint, steady glow. Ethan's breath caught. The hotel's main circuits had been dead for decades, yet here a hidden system still powered the lights. He turned slowly, shining his light into corners, but found only perfection. It was as though the moment the door had been sealed, this floor had been preserved in amber, untouched by decay. Behind him came the sound of quick footsteps. Lily had followed despite his warning, her eyes wide, as she stepped over the broken chain. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice quivering. It's alive up here." She reached for his hand, and he pulled her close, their eyes sweeping over the impossible hallway together. At the far end, double doors stood tall and silent, wood polished and gleaming even in the dim light. As they walked, the air felt different, cooler, thinner, as though filtered. When they reached the doors, Lily tugged his sleeve and pointed. Her small hand traced the edge of a bronze plaque affixed to the panel. The letters caught the light words, etched deep and deliberate. "Penthouse Private. Do not enter." Ethan ran his fingers over the plaque, feeling the grooves in the metal, the warning cold and heavy in his palm. He exchanged a glance with Lily, who bit her lip but did not let go of his hand. The storm outside raged, louder thunder booming as if in protest, but here on this hidden floor, the air was unnervingly still waiting. Ethan pushed open the double doors of the penthouse, his flashlight beam slicing across a room that seemed suspended in time. The space stretched wide, larger than he expected, with high ceilings, velvet drapes drawn but intact, and furniture arranged as though someone had left only yesterday. Yet it was not the furnishings that made his breath falter, but the walls. Along them hung paintings he recognized from history books, brushstrokes that shimmered under carefully angled lights. Monet's blurred water lilies, Renoir's warm portraits, Chagall's dreamlike figures, all glowing in perfect preservation. In glass cases stood marble busts with features chiseled so finely they seemed to breathe, and bronze figures frozen in eternal poise. Each piece gleamed as though untouched by dust, protected by invisible care. He stepped forward slowly, his boots sinking into the thick carpet, and noticed the quiet hum in the corners of the room. His eyes tracked to sleek, outdated machinery, dehumidifiers, filtration units, climate regulators fed by a dedicated service drop, and a bank of sealed batteries concealed behind a paneled wall. A faded inspection tag on the meter cabinet suggested a private maintenance contract that had kept the system alive far longer than the rest of the hotel. It dawned on him that someone had gone to unimaginable lengths to keep this collection alive, untouched, waiting. He counted quickly in his head, not because he wanted the wealth, but because his mind needed numbers to make sense of what his eyes could not deny. Even a single Renoir, a single Chagall could be worth millions. Here were dozens, along with statues that could belong to the halls of the world's greatest museums. $250 million at the very least, maybe more. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling his heart hammer the thought, both staggering and suffocating. Lily clung to his arm, her gaze wide as she whispered, "Ethan, this isn't just paintings. This is treasure." He swallowed, nodding slowly, but his jaw clenched as unease threaded through his awe. On the far side of the room, a narrow cabinet stamped 601 stood locked. He slid the corroded basement key into the lock and felt it turn. Inside, on the top shelf, lay a leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age but intact. The sight of it pulled at him like gravity. He crossed the room, each step deliberate, and lifted the volume. The cover bore no title, but the first page carried a simple inscription in neat, slanted script, Ich bin Heinrich Bauer. Ethan read the name aloud. His voice hushed. He turned the page. The entries alternated between German and English, the confession flowing in ink faded to sepia. For the German passages, he leaned on his phone and later a translator. The entries began with dates in the late 1940s, stretching through decades, the handwriting steady, precise. Bauer, as the pages revealed, had once been an officer in the German army during the war. The book unfolded a story Ethan felt heavy in his bones as he read. Bauer admitted to transporting works of art seized from Jewish families during the Holocaust pieces stolen in the chaos of war. He wrote of shipments hidden in trucks of collectors who demanded them of the moment he decided to betray those orders. He had smuggled much of the collection into America, concealed it within the Pine Harbor Hotel, and sealed it away. He had preserved it not out of nobility, but from fear, never daring to return it to rightful owners. Instead, he had maintained it with silent guilt, paying for upkeep until he could no longer bear the weight. "This is my sin," the words declared on one-page ink pressed so deeply into the paper it nearly tore through. These masterpieces belonged to families who were silenced. Their children died, their names erased. I carried them across oceans not to protect them, but because I lacked the courage to do what was right. If you are reading this, I beg you, do not repeat my cowardice. Return them. Ethan set the book down, his hands trembling, his throat dry. The air in the penthouse felt heavier now, as though the art itself whispered the names of those who had lost it. Lily looked up at him, confusion clouding her young face. "What does it mean?" she asked softly. He did not answer right away. He moved to a nearby painting, its brushwork delicate, alive with color, and imagined it once hanging in a family's home above a piano beside a dinner table where laughter once lived. He thought of the people Bauer described, entire lineages cut short, and felt the sting of shame, though none of it had been his doing. The weight of inheritance pressed against his chest, not of riches, but of responsibility. He finally spoke, his voice rough. "It means," he said, "these don't belong to us. They never did." Yet even as he said the words, the gnawing reality settled in his mind. $250 million of wealth sat within his reach, more than enough to rescue Lily, to give her a future untouched by want. The hotel could be restored in months, their lives transformed. But every canvas, every sculpture carried ghosts that would not let go, and on the desk the journal stared back, its plea etched into his conscience like a scar. The storm outside raged, on the thunder rolling as though the earth itself bore witness. Ethan shut the journal slowly, his hands lingering on the leather cover, and turned toward Lily, who clutched the hem of his jacket, her eyes searching his for answers he was not yet ready to give. Ethan sat at the mahogany desk long after Lily had fallen asleep, the leather-bound journal spread open before him, the lamplight pooling across its faded pages. His hand rested on one of the entries, the words etched into his mind like a voice he could not silence. "If anyone finds this, return them." I could not. Do not repeat my cowardice. He closed his eyes and exhaled, his mind split down the center. On one side stood duty, the voice of Heinrich Bauer, begging across decades the memory of families erased. On the other side was hunger, unpaid bills. Lily's fragile smile, the chance of a life where she could grow without fear. He whispered to himself. One painting, just one, and the thought hung heavy in the air. Just one canvas sold in secret could pay the bank, restore the hotel, put Lily through school. No one would ever have to know. He rubbed his scarred shoulder, feeling the ache of compromise like shrapnel still embedded under skin. The following days blurred into routine, Ethan rising early to split his hours between work at the lumber yard and the endless repairs of the hotel. But each time he passed the penthouse, he felt the pull of the paintings, their colors vivid under artificial light, their silence louder than words. He caught Lily watching him sometimes, her eyes searching as if she knew he carried something he was not telling her. Then came the knock. It was late after dark when the sound echoed through the cracked lobby doors. Ethan hesitated before answering, his hand instinctively tightening, as if expecting an enemy. Standing outside in the drizzle was a man in a tailored coat, his smile thin, his eyes too sharp. He introduced himself as a broker of rare collections, his voice smooth, his accent faint but polished. "A contractor from the courthouse called me after the auction," the man said, stepping inside, uninvited. "They mentioned the old rumors about a hidden floor. I hear you bought yourself quite the ruin, and maybe something more inside." Ethan's pulse quickened, his face hardening, but the man only smiled wider. "Let us not waste time. I know about the penthouse, about the paintings. I know what they're worth." He pulled out a slim envelope and placed it on the dusty counter. $5 million, cash, for one piece, no questions asked. The words struck like a hammer. $5 million, enough to end every worry, enough to build a future. Ethan stared at the envelope, his breath caught in his chest, but his silence betrayed him. The man leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You're a soldier, aren't you? You know value when you see it. You've given enough to this country. Why not take what the world owes you?" Ethan swallowed hard, his jaw clenched. Before he could answer, a sound came from the stairwell. Lily, her hair tousled from sleep, stood frozen halfway down, her eyes wide, as she looked between the stranger and her brother. She had heard everything. Tears welled in her eyes and her voice broke as she whispered, "You want to sell them. You want to sell someone's memories." Ethan's heart wrenched. He stepped toward her, but she pulled back. Shaking her head, her small hands balled into fists. "They belong to families, Ethan. Families who lost everything. You told me we would make this place a home. How can we if it's built on someone else's stolen past?" Her words cut sharper than any blade. The man in the coat smirked, sensing fracture, and placed the envelope closer. "Think carefully, Marine. $5 million buys freedom." Lily's sobs filled the lobby, her voice raw with betrayal. Ethan stood between the two forces, the weight of survival and the weight of conscience, his body rigid, his breath ragged. The journal's words thundered in his mind, and Lily's tears carved into him deeper than war ever had. That night after the stranger left, and Lily's tears had quieted into uneasy sleep, Ethan sat at the desk in the penthouse with the journal open and his old laptop humming faintly. The wireless signal barely reached the hotel, but it was enough. He typed the names from Bauer's ledger into search engines, family by family, painting by painting. Each entry felt like lighting a candle in a dark room. There were records on museum websites, Holocaust archives, even news articles from decades past. Every painting had once hung in a home that no longer existed. Every sculpture had belonged to lives extinguished in camps. Ethan leaned back in the velvet chair, the screen glow painting the exhaustion on his face, and felt the full gravity pressing in. These were not just objects, they were remnants of stolen lives. He scrolled further, his pulse slowing only when he came across a familiar name, Rosenfeld. He clicked the link, and a photograph appeared on the screen, a family portrait from Vienna in the 1930s. Parents smiling with their children, a painting visible behind them. The same painting now hung 2 rooms away in the penthouse. His chest tightened, memory stirring. Rosenfeld. The name was not only from the past. He had known it carried it in another life. Afghanistan years ago, on a patrol when the dust and heat had swallowed everything, Ethan had been thrown down by the blast of an IED, his vision read the ground spinning. He remembered a medic kneeling over him, hands steady, voice calm, patching a wound that could have ended him. That medic had introduced himself as Captain Daniel Rosenfeld. Ethan remembered the strength of his grip, the quiet determination in his eyes. He had survived that day because of Rosenfeld, now decades and continents apart. The ledger whispered that the art on these walls had once belonged to Rosenfeld's family, stolen during the Holocaust, scattered into silence. Ethan pressed his hand against his temple, overwhelmed by the collision of memory and history. This was not coincidence. This was connection across generations, across wars, across suffering. He looked at Lily's drawings scattered on the table beside him, her houses with bright windows, her stick figures of them holding hands, and realized the truth was larger than them both. These paintings were not wealth waiting to be claimed. They were bloodlines cut short, but still reaching. He rose and walked to the nearest canvas, staring at its colors the way the brushstrokes seemed alive. He imagined Captain Rosenfeld's grandmother touching the same frame, imagined a living room where children once played beneath its shadow. He thought of the medic's steady hands saving his life, of the legacy that had nearly been erased. His own reflection in the glass seemed small against such weight. His knees weakened, and he sank into a chair, head bowed. He whispered, "This is not ours. It never was." The journal's words returned to him with greater force. "Return them. Do not repeat my cowardice." For the first time since returning from war, Ethan felt clarity sharper than any weapon. He understood now this was not a fortune. This was history crying out for justice. The decision began to take shape inside him. Not easy, not without fear, but certain. He knew that to keep even one piece would be to betray not just strangers long gone, but also the man who had saved his life in the desert, a man whose family's voice was among those silenced and now waiting to be heard again. The paintings no longer looked like opportunity. They looked like testimony. Ethan closed the laptop slowly, his hand steady now, and lifted the journal once more. He ran his thumb along the name Rosenfeld, feeling the bond stretch from the past into his present. In that moment, the weight shifted. He no longer felt trapped between survival and temptation. He felt chosen, as though the responsibility had sought him out across oceans and time, and refusing it would mean betraying not only strangers but also himself. He glanced at Lily asleep on the couch, her face calm. At last, her notebook clutched in her hands. He knew the path ahead would be harder than he could yet imagine, but he also knew there was no other path he could take. The morning after his long night of searching, Ethan stood in the lobby of the Pine Harbor Hotel. With the phone pressed tightly to his ear, his voice steadier than he felt. He spoke to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., explaining haltingly at first, and then with growing clarity what he had found. He gave them the names, the details from the ledger, the evidence that the paintings and sculptures preserved in the penthouse were stolen during the war. On the other end of the line, the silence was profound, broken only by the intake of breath from the director, who finally said, "Mr. Cole, you may have just uncovered one of the largest known unreturned Holocaust-era collections in recent decades." Within 48 hours, the quiet town of Millbrook transformed into a stage. Black SUVs with government plates lined the street outside the hotel. News vans crowded the sidewalks, their satellite dishes reaching for the sky. Reporters called out questions as Ethan shielded Lily with his arm and guided her through the lobby where FBI agents, curators in white gloves, and town officials moved with urgency. Each painting was removed carefully, cataloged, verified, the truth of their value and origin impossible to deny. Ethan tried to stay in the background, but the spotlight inevitably found him. Cameras sought his face, microphones, hovered, neighbors watched from a distance. He answered as little as possible, always with Lily close his words, plain, "They don't belong to me. They belong to the families who lost them." The response was not universally supportive. A week later, in a hastily arranged hearing at the county courthouse, a new figure appeared, a polished lawyer representing the surviving heirs of Heinrich Bauer. She stood with a briefcase and a cool expression, announcing that under federal inheritance law, the collection belonged to Bauer's bloodline, not to strangers or institutions. Murmurs filled the courtroom, reporters scribbling, cameras flashing. Ethan sat rigid, his jaw tight, Lily clutching his hand. The lawyer argued with precision, citing statutes, legal precedents, emphasizing that the hotel had been Bauer's property, and thus everything within was his legacy. The Cole family has no claim, she concluded sharply. The proper course is for these works to be returned to Bauer's descendants. Ethan felt the eyes of the room on him, weighing his silence. He thought of Bauer's journal, the words inked in guilt, the plea for redemption. He wanted to rise to shout, but something held him back. Then, unexpectedly, The sound of a chair scraping against the wooden floor cut through the air. Lily stood. 11 years old, small among the towering adults, yet her voice was clear when she clutched the worn journal to her chest. "I have something to read," she said, and the judge, taken aback, nodded for her to continue. She opened the book to a page marked by Ethan's hand and read aloud, her voice trembling, but growing stronger. "This is my sin. These masterpieces belonged to families who were silenced. Their children died, their names erased. I carried them across oceans not to protect them, but because I lacked the courage to do what was right. If you are reading this, I beg you, do not repeat my cowardice. Return them." The courtroom fell silent. Her words, spoken from Bauer's own hand, hung like a prayer in the stale air. Reporters lowered their pens for a moment, neighbors shifted uncomfortably, and even the lawyer faltered her polished certainty, cracking under the weight of a confession undeniable. Lily closed the journal with care, her small voice carrying one more thought. He didn't want his grandchildren to be rich from what he stole. He wanted someone brave to give it back. "My brother is doing what he asked." Applause began softly in the gallery, then grew louder, echoing against the paneled walls. The judge rapped his gavel for order, but did not hide the emotion in his own eyes. Ethan reached for Lily's hand, squeezing it, as tears threatened to break through the walls he had built inside himself. In that moment, he understood that the truth had spoken louder than law, that history itself had a voice, and it had come through the words of his sister. Outside the courthouse, the crowd surged, reporters clamoring for comment. Townspeople divided between pride and disbelief. Ethan kept his arm around Lily, guiding her through the press of bodies, knowing the battle was far from over. The question of ownership still loomed, legal lines still blurred, but public opinion was shifting. The truth had been spoken aloud, and it could not be taken back. Weeks passed in a blur of headlines, legal hearings, and interviews that Ethan never sought but could not avoid. The weight of the discovery had pulled the small town of Millbrook into the orbit of history, and with it came endless questions of ownership, restitution, and responsibility. Ethan stood quietly through it all, his uniform a steady presence in photographs, his expression firm but humble. Finally, after long deliberations, a state court, following federal guidance on Holocaust-era art claims, appointed Ethan Cole, the lawful purchaser of the Pine Harbor Hotel, as a court-supervised custodian of the collection, with authority to facilitate restitution to proven heirs. The judgment came not with triumph, but with relief. He watched as crates were packed with precision as agents and curators prepared shipments bound for families across the world. Each time a painting was lifted from the wall, he felt the burden lighten, not because wealth was leaving, but because justice was finally being served. The first family to arrive in Millbrook was the Goldsteins, their surviving granddaughter, clutching a faded photograph of a dining room where a Monet once hung. When the crate was opened and the painting revealed, she wept openly, her hands trembling as she traced the brushstrokes, whispering, "I never thought I would see this again." Others followed, families from New York, Paris, Tel Aviv, each carrying stories of loss and memory, each breaking into tears when the pieces of their heritage were returned. Ethan stood in the background, often silent, sometimes shaking hands, sometimes simply offering his presence. For many, that was enough. They thanked him not only for the art, but for the choice he had made, for the refusal to turn their memories into currency. Word of his decision spread beyond the town and beyond the country. An international foundation dedicated to cultural restitution reached out announcing a grant to preserve the Pine Harbor Hotel itself. They pledged millions not for Ethan's personal gain, but to transform the ruin into something greater, the House of Memory, a place that would honor those who lost everything and teach generations to come about the cost of silence and the power of courage. When the announcement was made, Ethan felt Lily slip her hand into his. She smiled through tears, whispering, "Now everyone will know this place isn't haunted anymore. It's healing." Construction crews arrived, scaffolding rose, and before restoration, the legacy power unit was removed under federal supervision. Neighbors who once mocked his purchase now volunteered their labor carrying wood painting walls, planting gardens. The hotel, once a carcass of decay, began to breathe again. The lobby was restored into a community hall. Classrooms were added on the second floor, and the penthouse became a permanent exhibit, curated with photographs, digital archives, and the story of how one soldier and his sister stumbled upon a sealed door and chose truth over fortune. Months later, during a dedication ceremony attended by survivors' descendants, officials, and townspeople, Ethan stood at the podium in his uniform, Lily beside him. He looked out at the crowd, at faces both familiar and new, and spoke quietly but firmly. "I bought the Pine Harbor Hotel because I wanted to give my sister a roof. I never imagined it would give us a purpose. These walls hid sorrow, but now they hold memory, and memory is what keeps the truth alive." The applause that followed was long, but Ethan's eyes searched until they found one person among the crowd. A woman stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held a painting against her chest, her eyes red from weeping. She introduced herself as Miriam Rosenfeld, daughter of Captain Daniel Rosenfeld, the military medic who had once saved Ethan's life in Afghanistan. She presented a signed long-term loan agreement for the House of Memory, allowing the painting to remain as part of the exhibit, her voice breaking as she said, "This belonged to my grandmother. My father always believed goodness could survive in dark times. He would have trusted you. He did trust you even before he knew you would return this. Overcome." Ethan bowed his head as she embraced him, her tears wetting his shoulder, her words echoing in his heart. The connection felt like a circle closing across time. One life saved in war, another family's memory saved in peace. When the ceremony ended, Lily tugged his sleeve, pointing at the newly hung sign above the restored entrance, the House of Memory. Its letters gleamed in the sunlight, bright and unbroken. Ethan placed his hand on her shoulder and whispered, "This place belongs to memory now, and it's ours to care for." She smiled, her eyes clear with pride. That evening, as the sun set over Millbrook, the hotel lights shone across the town, no longer dark, no longer silent. Children played in the courtyard. Families gathered in the hall, and in the penthouse, the stories of the past were displayed with reverence. Ethan walked through the halls quietly, pausing at Lily's drawings now framed among the exhibits, small reminders that hope had guided them, even when the world seemed broken. He thought of Bauer's journal now preserved under glass, its words no longer hidden, but teaching others that redemption can be found when someone dares to do what is right. He thought of Captain Rosenfeld, of the steady hands that had saved him, and felt gratitude for the chance to honor that debt in a way that mattered. Standing at the tall window of the penthouse, Ethan looked out over the town, the lights glowing like constellations scattered across the dark. He felt the weight he had carried lift at last, replaced by something stronger than survival purpose. Lily's laughter echoed up the stairs, clear and unafraid. For the first time in years, Ethan smiled without hesitation, knowing that the hotel was no longer a monument to secrecy, but a beacon of memory, and that their lives bound to its story had been transformed forever. If you've been following Ethan and Lily's journey, I'd love to hear what you think. Which moment struck you the most? The discovery of the sealed penthouse, the courtroom where Lily spoke, or the final return of the Rosenfeld painting? Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and let's see how far this story has traveled. And if you'd like more stories like this, ordinary people facing extraordinary choices, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.